All right, there we go. Kim, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you to Mikkel and to Jenny Hansen, who helped arrange this with setting everything up for the Sustainability Week. So I'm really glad to be here and to get to share with you my new book, Under the Sky We Make, How to Be Human in a Warming World. And Mikkel has been a wonderful discussion partner. We've already had very interesting conversations, and I'm looking forward to talking more today. Should I go ahead? You want to say something first, Mikkel, or should I go ahead and dive into the reading?
No, I would love for you to start with the reading to get everybody
Okay.
a taste of what this book is about.
Okay, so I know that Mikkel has read it very carefully and has formulated, I told him, better questions than the BBC asked me last week. So I really look forward to that. But by popular demand, or he suggested starting off with the reading. And so I will love to share that with you now. If you have it at home, you can read along on page 210. So this is in a chapter that's talking about the economics of climate change, and in particular, my own personal experience of devastating fires that have affected my family and in Northern California. And they were evacuated in 2017. Thankfully, my parents and my sister were safe, but it has been really devastating for my hometown and community. One of the 2019 fires, the Kincaid Fire, again set wine country ablaze. Numbly reading the news, I saw a photo of a woman who looked like a suburban soccer mom, walking down a highway in flip-flops, pushing a wheelbarrow filled with her remaining earthly possessions. My friend Mara wrote on Facebook, "Climate refugees fleeing just 50 miles from San Francisco." That could have been anyone I love. That could have been me. 15% of Californians live among the dry, remote hills and forests in areas classed as extreme fire danger. Some analysts are already saying those areas should be abandoned for human habitation because they're too expensive and impractical to protect under California's new climate-changed fire regime. Journalist David Roberts wrote, "Denser, safer areas of the state will have to make room for them." Meanwhile, the governor opposed limiting housing expansion in remote wild areas that spread people out among tightly packed dead trees, claiming it was against California's wild and pioneering spirit. No politician wants to fight the real estate lobby. But the climate doesn't listen to lobbyists, and the sheer economics of increasing climate costs are starting to speak for themselves. Homeowners insurance companies in California paid out $1.70 for every dollar of premiums they collected in 2018, and are balking at insuring an increasing number of seaside and floodplain homes in the United States. As climate change makes insurance more necessary, it is rewriting the bottom line for insurance companies. Their old business model is breaking down. I was unceremoniously dumped by my insurance company in August 2020. I inherited a farmhouse on my grandparents' old turkey ranch, where I lived for 5 years and have imagined retiring. Precisely as a new gang of catastrophic wildfires were tearing through wine country, raining ash and turning the sun an apocalyptic orange through lung-searing smoke, I opened a letter. "Your property is located in an area subject to high risk for wildfire, which increases the risk for fire or smoke damage. As a result, this policy will be non-renewed, effective 12/6/2020. I felt a cold lead weight in the pit of my stomach. How could I plan to grow old in a house too dangerous to insure? How could it be safe for anyone to live there? The financial case for climate action is overwhelmingly clear, and the costs of inaction are intolerable. Beyond dollars and cents, homes and livelihoods and ways of life, even whole cities and countries, are at risk from climate loss. These are prices that are too high to pay. We simply can't afford not to fix it. We just can't expect that climate change will be solved through economic tools alone. We have to retool our economy to protect what we really value most, by keeping fossil fuels in the ground, while increasing resilience to face the risks already elevated from warming." Thanks.
Thank you so much for reading that. And to those of you who dropped in during the reading, hi and welcome. This is a discussion, an interview with me, Michael, and Dr. Kimberly Nicholas, who you just heard reading, climate scientist and author of this new book, Under the Sky We Make. We will be discussing a bunch of questions today, not only climate, but what it means to be human in a lot of ways, and how we can avoid this looming climate disaster. Some quick introductions. Dr. Nicholas is an associate professor here at Lund University, Center for Sustainability Science, holding a PhD in Environment and Resources from Stanford University. Her research is diverse. She's, for instance, researched agricultural policy, how to get the municipality to radically reduce their emissions, studied the flight-free movement, and more. Diverse, but unified by the common thread of solving the climate crisis. Maybe that's an unfair way of saying it, but that's what I gathered from it. All of that and more, and what we just heard, you can read in this new book that we'll be talking about today. If you still do not have it, you can see a bunch of links to where to get it on the Facebook event page. I will also put a link here to Kim's link tree, where you can find it regardless of which continent you're on. For those of you wondering who I am, once again, I'm Michael. I'm a master's student at Luxus, where Kim teaches occasionally. More importantly, I'm the chairperson of a student organization called the Lund Climate Students. It's an immensely rewarding and important organization. You can be part of both Lund and all across Sweden. Here in Lund, our goal is to make the university something that we can all be proud of. And that takes both science and the Paris Agreement seriously, and primarily lives by those values. Currently, suffice to say, we do not think Lund University lives up to those values. So we engage weekly with headmasters, deans, sustainability experts to try to make Lund as sustainable as possible in a myriad of ways, not the least like hosting conversations like these. We're always looking for members, and next week we're choosing a new board. So if you're engaged, make sure to join and send an email our way. If you have any further questions on that, feel free to reach out to us either here or on Facebook afterwards. Now, back to the task at hand. Kim and I will be discussing this book for a while, and then we will open up the floor for questions afterwards. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function. It should be in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom interface. And then I will read the questions to Kim, because unfortunately, with the webinar function, you are invisible and inaudible. All right, with all those introductions out of the way, Kim, thank you for reading once again. It really set the tone, not only for your book and for our interview, but I feel it sets a backdrop for this critical decade that we find ourselves in generally. Thank you for being here today. First and foremost, how are you feeling?
Well, very happy to be here. Very happy to have this discussion. I am really enjoying the chance to talk about the book. I've been working on it for 4 years. I started in August of 2017, I guess, and it just came out March this year. So it's been a very long process. And as you said, we don't have much time. So, I mean, trying to make the best use of the time I have invested in sort of distilling what I know and what research tells us of how we can actually solve the climate crisis. I'm trying to get the word out.
That is super interesting, and I'd like to ask you about that immediately, because in this book you talk a lot about your own journey from like a dispassionate scientist to an activist and more like a vocal proponent of climate adaptation. So do you think this is something that more scientists should do? Do you feel it's necessary, especially with the limited time that we have?
Well, I certainly don't speak for all of science or all scientists in how we should engage, but I definitely think that there's so much more room for scientists to be publicly engaged, and that can take many different forms. Writing op-eds, talking with public audiences, whether it's school kids or community groups or faith groups or whatever groups that you're already a part of. I think that can be super effective of sort of bringing your whole self and the causes and values that you care about to the communities that you're a part of. And we know from research also that the public wants to hear from science and scientists. The public values expertise. You might not believe it from reading the headlines, but the majority of the public really cares about and is concerned about and even alarmed about the climate crisis, and would love to hear more about it from the people who know the most about it. And I think those conversations are really important for us to take.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned in the book that 60% of Americans want scientists to be more engaged in policy debates. So what you're talking about now is quite different from policy. It's more just getting the word out. But do you see a future with like scientists, politicians, or science getting more engaged in policy in some way?
Well, it'd be hard to be less. So yes, I hope the future is more. Yes, I do, because I think that statistic, 60%, is that Americans want scientists engaged in matters of public debate related to their expertise. So I do think we have an opportunity and really an obligation to share our knowledge for the public benefit. And I mean, that's really at the heart of the social contract for science as I see it. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that more deeply. And I think scientists can engage both from our coming from a place of expertise, here's my knowledge, here's what I study, and also as a citizen, here's what I care about, here's what I'm concerned about. And we are seeing increasingly scientists becoming more alarmed by our own findings and compelled to speak out more publicly, because we see that politics and business as usual is just not changing fast enough. And I think in particular, as a sustainability scientist, I feel a particular obligation to deliver what society has told us the world wants. I mean, through these democratic processes of the Paris Agreement, through the UN climate negotiations, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are tying together everything here at Sustainability Week. I mean, the world has said, this is the world we want to live in. We want a stable climate. We want a thriving planet. We want a world where everyone can thrive and achieve their potential as a human and have their needs met. So that's not the world we live in today, and it's not the world we're creating by the policies and decisions we're making now. So I think pointing out that gap and ways to close that gap is really at the heart of being a sustainability scientist, as I see it.
Yeah, that's an admirable stance as well. And like in the book, you mention a lot, and you're kind of hinting at it now as well, being a sustainability scientist, sorry, and talking about like these proponent of change. How has your own journey been? Can you talk a bit about it? Because you're doing the book, but for those who maybe haven't read it, being a scientist and learning about these things and then adapting your own personal life to kind of live or practice as you preach.
Yeah. Sure. Well, the book is divided into 3 parts, which are facts, feelings, and action. And if I think about my own journey, and my argument is that we need all 3 to effectively solve the climate crisis. If I think about my own journey, it probably starts with feelings of growing up in a beautiful place, enjoying spending time outside, getting to university and having a chance to be a research assistant and get paid to go hiking and count plants and spend 2 weeks in the mountains, which, is what I like to do for fun. So that was a wonderful opportunity for me. And then really enjoying the intellectual challenge of science and the problem solving and the creativity that goes into it, and learning new things is just really fun. So then spending years in grad school, I like the cartoon that pictures grad school as, or research in general, but especially what you're trying to do in grad school is like, here's the whole sphere of human knowledge, and you're trying to make this tiny, tiny, tiny microscopic dent to, infinitesimally expand that border of human knowledge. So that is a demanding process, but it is really fun and enjoyable. But then I think the feelings part has become a bigger part of it for me, certainly since moving to Lund. I came here in 2010. And I think that's just part of the experience of being alive right now, that, our students today have grown up much more embedded in the climate crisis for their whole lives. It's been part of their reality always. I've had students tearing up in my office talking about the systems that they're studying not being there when they are undertaking their careers, and how can I work on these policies or try to model these systems if they are going to be slated to be wiped out under the current scenarios. So I think it's not just statistics and numbers on a graph, which is more how it felt for me when I was doing my training, and we are now living through the experience of dangerous climate change. And, we as humans have emotional reactions to that, which is appropriate and good. It would be wrong if we didn't, because things that we love are people and places, and things that we love are threatened and being hurt. So of course we should have a response to that. And I think for me, that's been part of galvanizing action. So I came here in 2010. That was my peak flying year. So I'm a recovering frequent flyer. And that year I took 15 round trip flights. And that is globally very unusual. But for me and for kind of the group, the cohort I was a part of, that was not that unusual. And it was seen as a sign of success and career advancement. But then I chose to start flying less in 2012. And then I was inspired by my friend Charlie, who had done that, stopped flying within Europe and was still attending conferences and being a productive scientist. And I realized I could also do that. So I think my own journey and sort of practicing what I preach has been both inspired by the research showing that it's really important for scientists to do that the public is more willing to listen to us and more willing to undertake their own behavior changes and to support more ambitious policies if we practice what we preach, which totally makes sense. I mean, I think if your doctor is puffing on a cigarette and telling you to quit, it's not very convincing. But also being inspired by friends and colleagues and people around me and seeing this kind of groundswell of action, and that fits with what we know about how social change actually happens. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
No, excellent. And I think this idea of having the doctor who smokes is a really apt example, because if we have a bunch of climate scientists who are still flying around everywhere and not practicing what they preach, so to speak, it's hard to take it too seriously. And the same goes with politicians or anything. It's hard for someone to tell you what to do and when they're not doing it themselves. But something you mentioned there really struck a chord in me as well that I thought was interesting, which is about inhibiting grief of climate losses. And like in the book, you talk about having a funeral for an Icelandic glacier. And I think that was really, really beautiful. And talking about the student that you had like crying in your office, how do you, the more you know about this, the worse it becomes in many ways. Of course, it's hopeful, but how do you deal with this grief of that climate change inhibits, of living in the Anthropocene? Because it's deeply personal in a lot of ways as well.
Yeah, I think for me, I have learned a lot about grief from losing one of my best friends to lung cancer when he was 37. And I think going through that experience and with his wife, who is a really dear friend and an amazing human being and someone who is just like an exemplary human, I think she's taught me a lot about that basically the main lesson I took away from being in this really terrible and tragic and difficult situation was it doesn't help to avoid pain, that basically pain, if you are trying to avoid what you resist persists, maybe is a way to say it, that if you aren't facing the truth of both the facts and your feelings, you're not doing yourself or anyone else any favors. And so it's actually better to face the hard realities, even when they are extremely sad, and feel sad about them and grieve them and have rituals like you mentioned, this funeral that was held in Iceland, or drinking what I fear may be the last bottle of wine that to me really tastes like my hometown, which is Sonoma Pinot Noir, and that taste is changing because of climate change. So I think it doesn't help to pretend these things aren't happening, but actually fully being present and witnessing and sort of giving them my full attention is giving them the respect that they deserve, and also helping me mobilize my feelings in community with others to actually make the necessary changes. I mean, feeling like what's really important and what matters is at stake has been really galvanizing.
Yeah, that's beautiful. You also talk a bit about how, well, because for me at least, the book was quite tough to read in large segments emotionally. But you have a couple of things that are really hopeful, especially the way you explain or describe, what's happened in the last couple of years. But how do you stay hopeful in the light of everything that's going on? What are the positives you see?
Well, I always find that question actually really challenging, because I feel like often it's asked as kind of a proxy for how screwed are we? And, is it too late and can I give up? Or is it going to be easy and then I don't have to care because someone else is going to solve it? And I actually really struggle with what I feel like is this emotional burden that's placed on climate and sustainability scientists of, oh, now we have to strike this perfect tone of, it's dire, but there's hope and we have to galvanize people before it's too late. So I actually find that really challenging, because I feel like hope in a sense can be very naive, like a feeling, oh, everything is going to be fine and you don't have to worry. And that's not honest. So I don't want to give people that kind of hope. But what I do deeply believe in, and the hope that I do want to give people, and I hope I do through this book, is that what we do really matters. And we are alive at this incredibly critical, the most critical time really to be a human is right now, because we are the stewards of this last sliver of the carbon budget, which is for all of humanity for all of time. And a lot has gone wrong until now. So we have inherited the very last remaining bit of it, but we actually can steward it well and, make the necessary changes to stabilize the climate. And that will be the most epic and heroic and amazing thing that humanity ever does if we manage to pull it off. So I think what keeps me going is just feeling really deeply that that is incredibly important and significant and meaningful. And even though it's very hard to feel like anything I do on a day-to-day basis is actually making a difference. I talked to a friend the other day who spent time in the Peace Corps, and he said that what they talk about there is planting seeds, that you can't really judge your actions or your impact by the immediate results. And you don't know, many of these seeds may never bloom. You don't know which ones will or not. It's going to be a long time before you see the results, if any, but you keep doing the work and doing what you can, what is kind of within your power and your gifts and abilities to do. And that is, really, really, really meaningful and important. And then I think there's the last thing I'll say is, taking care of yourself and each other is really important. And, taking breaks, spending time in nature, exercise, gardening, wine, conversations with family and friends. I mean, those kind of things that are really at the core of maintaining good health, because nothing works if you don't have that. So yeah, some combination of those things.
Or good book discussions over Zoom also
Yes.
promotes health.
Yes.
But while we're on it, why don't you give us the quick 30-second or 1-minute rundown of the key things every individual can do to promote climate health, so to speak.
Sure. So if you are a high emitting person, like I said that I was, certainly as a frequent flyer, then it's really important to cut your own personal emissions. And that's because about half of household climate pollution comes from the 10% of the population who pollutes the most. So if you're in that group, the most effective things you can do are to go flight, car, and meat free, in that order. And if you can't go all the way, then cutting those areas at least in half from your current consumption is a great goal to start with. And then all of us can be engaged in our communities and as citizens. So that looks different for everybody, but basically it is doing an inventory of where is my sphere of power? Where do I have, contacts and connections? What do I like doing and find fun to do and I'm good at doing? Because that's the kind of work you can sustain. And how can I then turn those skills into working for a stable climate, for climate justice? And that could be, for example, engaging with the climate movement. So supporting and engaging with groups like Climate Students Lund, for example, very good one. It's about putting your money where your mouth is, and about economic and political and social changes. And maybe we'll go more into that. But, the bottom line is it's both individual and systems that need to change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's easy I don't know, maybe it's more for me because I see that there are more roadmaps for individual change. We know that if we go, meat-free or flight-free or things like this, we can have an impact. But the roadmaps or utopian ideals, or maybe not utopian, but like actual roadmaps of how to get to a carbon-free society don't seem nearly as clear and nearly as visible. Do you have any good roadmaps, or do you have any, how do I put that, radical transformations that you would see would upend a lot of society as it is now, but for the better?
It's so interesting that you say that, because the data say there are so many roadmaps actually for how to do what we need to as a society. And they're at every level. There's one for every US state. There's one for most countries in the world to get carbon-free energy to meet their energy needs. There are roadmaps for how to have sustainable land use and agriculture and what that looks like. And, but the thing is, they're not sexy. I mean, they're long PDFs that never get downloaded and have, 21 policy points and they're not visions or utopias, certainly. They're like briefing documents and, we ran this model and it says we need to conserve existing forests and expand peatlands while, reducing meat consumption and blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, I think where I would go for visions is probably more in literature or in art. And I mean, science is not going to be our fountain of inspiring visions, maybe. And maybe it's not fair to ask scientists to play that role, because that is where art and literature and the humanities and storytelling and narrative come in. So I think I'm a part of the climate fiction book circle that's organized through the Climaginaries group. Kimberly Nicholas runs it. And that's been really, really important and inspiring for me over the years. Now I think we're about 3 years in, and I have a bunch of those books that I've read on my shelf behind me. And I think those have been, many are dystopic, but I just read Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future. And that is not a utopia by any means, but I found it inspiring because it felt like a pathway that I could actually imagine, like this could work. Here could be, the kind of social and political and economic changes coupled with personal changes that do stabilize the climate. And it's not I'm not saying that is the particular pathway I favor, but it was helpful to read it as a story and to feel like, oh, all the pieces kind of fit together and it's not just a, model output, because that's not very inspiring.
Yeah, I read it recently too. I'm really, really impressed with his knowledge in the field, especially from somebody outside of it. I also thought it was really interesting how you mentioned that there actually is a minister for the future in Wales, I think, in the book.
Yes.
Which I all of a sudden connected the dots.
Yeah, the timing on that was really funny. I actually met her at a conference a few years ago. Yes. And I think some more countries I don't know if they have adopted or are in the process of adopting, but someone who actually explicitly has the role of serving as a voice for future generations in government decisions and representing their interests at the table. And that's so important because that's not being done now. And, short-term decision making is leading to catastrophe, basically. So this kind of longer term and more equitable perspective is super important.
I think not to segue too much into that book, but I think like one of the things that we often forget when it comes to climate change is just like all the problems it will bring with it. And I think his way of introducing eco-terrorism as something that is likely to happen when people keep flying, I think that is also like a problem that we might well see, and similar things that I'd never thought about before. And your book did that as well, of just like introducing the problem to, well, the book is quite America-centered, and how even the rich Americans have these problems, and like yourself do with wildfires and things. I would like to discuss some other things though, because I see we have some lacking time. And one of the questions is that we talked briefly in mail about freedom and what your thoughts on freedom are in regard to the climate. And just give some context, if we acknowledge that we live in a world of finite resources and we want to live sustainably, does that not inherently mean that we need to allocate the resources available? And if we then do, does that not fundamentally contradict free market and individual consumptions as kind of utility ideals? So it's becoming a big question, but especially as an American, do you have any thoughts on this, and where do we go with it?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So I did write this book in particular with an American audience in mind. The reason for that is because my book contract is actually in the US right now, and the book is available here, and pretty much all of it also applies elsewhere. But I wanted to especially focus on Americans who are, my family and friends and people I went to school with, who I think need to make the biggest changes So I thought if I can get the Americans on board, then the Swedes, will follow. That should be fine. But to answer your question, or attempt to answer one piece of it, I would say that yes, we live on a finite planet. We do not have infinite resources. We are very close to our carbon budget, for example. There are many other planetary boundaries we have exceeded or are close to exceeding. And to me, this means we should be rethinking what is the point of all of this? And to me, that's what I get at in the book with this idea of switching from the exploitation to the regeneration mindset. So I see the root cause of all of our problems, basically, as some humans thinking they are superior to other humans instead of recognizing our fundamental equal value, and humans in general thinking we are superior to nature, and those kind of relationships causing exploitation of each other and of nature. So to get around that, I'm saying we should focus on centering and caring for and protecting and valuing people and nature, strengthening our capacity to adapt, and getting at the root cause of harm. And if we do that, this is, the reason that I think this is an answer to your question is, yes, we have to think about, well, what is meaning? And I talk about, maximizing meaning and minimizing carbon as one way of living a good life in the climate constrained situation that we're in now. And I think that's very possible to do. But it will certainly require us to reframe the purpose of life away from consumption, because it is not a fundamental human right or even a basic need to fly in planes or drive SUVs. And if we frame that as the point that the market is supposed to deliver, then we're totally screwed, because yes, we cannot just keep doing that without breaking our carbon bank and causing disastrous climate breakdown. But on the other hand, if we think about, well, what is actually necessary and important and required for a safe and meaningful and happy and prosperous life? I mean, I really like Kate Rayworth's idea of the donut, the safe and just operating space. So, living within our means ecologically, but also meeting human needs for democracy and sanitation and education and equality. And growth, economic growth, then becomes not the point. She calls herself a growth agnostic, which is, basically saying growth might happen or not in terms of GDP, but what we care about is the growth of well-being of people and nature, basically. And we need an economy that makes us thrive whether or not it grows, instead of an economy that has to grow whether or not we thrive. We have to sort of recenter our values.
I love this idea of the regeneration mindset and how it gets to the core of the problem, to the crux of it. So I suppose the $1 million question then is, if we have this regeneration mindset and our current system is exploitative, and you do a great job in also underscoring that this goes through everything. This is the reason why we have misogynist or feminist issues or racist issues, or people generally feel they're more worth than nature or those around them. And some people's time are worth more than others because they get paid more, etc. So our economy is built on this exploitation mindset. Can we keep the economy as it is? And you can answer that as either a neoclassical economy or a capitalist economy, however big you want to answer it, I suppose. But is it possible to keep it and transform to a regeneration mindset?
I honestly have no idea. And that's why I kind of avoided that question in the book, because, I basically said, as I just summarized a second ago, here's what we need to do. Here's what we need the economy to deliver. Yeah. Now, the question, as I understand the question you're framing, is green growth possible? So can we have the basically, economic system that we have today, but decouple environmental harm from economic growth? Or do we have to have degrowth or some other fundamentally different purpose of the economy? And I honestly don't know the answer to that. I mean, I was at a workshop on this very topic last week, and I thought it was really interesting that some of the world's leading experts on this are saying no one really knows the answer to this. I mean, there are strongly held opinions on both sides. I'm very skeptical. I think the changes we have to make are very fundamental, and certainly I don't see evidence of that happening at all in today's current system. But I think that, there could be a convincing argument that it is not theoretically impossible. You could say, okay, if we actually set the limits of the market to say, this is what we have to protect, these are, you're not allowed to expand rainforest destruction, you're not allowed to burn fossil fuels, those are regulations, and then the market can work within that to efficiently distribute resources. That could definitely work. And we also have never really used everyone recognizes the market is really inefficient today, and inequality is very high, and a lot of outcomes are very bad for many people. So no one is saying, oh, everything is working great as it is now. So even the true green growthers, the people who genuinely believe this is the way to deliver prosperity and well-being, both for people and planet, they'll say, well, we've never tried green growth because we don't have the right policies in place. We aren't pricing externalities. We aren't using the regulatory tools that have to be part of the market economy as it is. So yeah, I genuinely don't know, but I want people who focus on that to figure it out really fast, because we need to choose and go that way ASAP.
Yeah, no, I hear you. So what about a smaller question then? Because somehow the kind of, if you're looking at America, that this book is not only, but to a large extent, I was thinking that the American example of like how much carbon they are emitting as a society is so much greater than per person than it is in a lot of other places, and that this neoliberal small-scale government has arguably been one of the worst ways of dealing with it. So do you then think this kind of Biden large-scale government is better, or would you prefer another kind of solution to it?
Well, I'm very happy with the change in government, of course, in the US in the last few months. And I mean, this is the government we have, and the policies that are being proposed are certainly the best that the US has ever done. They are still not good enough, but it is helpful and necessary to have large-scale government policies to, for example, decarbonize the electricity sector in a country and in the world, so that we can essentially have clean electricity and run everything on it. So that is how we get away from using fossil fuels, is we leave them in the ground, we make clean energy, mostly from wind and sun, and we power everything we can on those things. And we have the techniques, the technology and the knowledge and the stuff, the hardware that we need ready to do that today for about 75% of emissions. So there are some sectors that are harder to decarbonize, but guess what? We have our work cut out for us till 2030 and beyond, because it's just about implementing the stuff that we already have at hand and know works, because we have to cut emissions about in half by 2030 globally. So I'm happy with positive steps in the right direction, but it is nowhere near enough. So I mean, that means that grassroots movements and individual action and community and organizational action and private sector action are still super important and necessary to close those gaps.
Yeah. I think kind of framing what we talked a bit about, or we talked about so far, and framing that in a kind of positive light, is we talked a bit about scientists and how scientists can work, or they have their work cut out for them as well, and work towards making sustainability more of a thing that everybody talks about. Let's put it that way, as most Americans want. We have a bigger government that is trying to do better things. And you mentioned, and others have mentioned previously, that you only need the critical mass of you say 25%. I've heard different numbers before. I don't know exactly where it is. But surely we must be approaching it soon. And once we get to that point, hopefully things will get a lot better. So I feel as well that starting it off, especially in the US, it's such a big economy, is incredible in some ways.
Yeah, that's right. So what the research shows for a social tipping point in norm, so what we expect of ourselves and others, basically, excuse me, basically what you do when no one is watching, that tipping point is around 25%. So that is good news, because it's not a majority. You don't have to win an election. You can get a committed minority who are vocal and committed in spreading that norm, and it actually works to change the expectations and norms of the society as a whole. So that is really positive. And one example that I write about in the book is the flying less, or the flight free movement that started here in Sweden, because obviously the situation of air travel has been different under the pandemic, but looking at the data before the pandemic, it was getting close to something like 20% of people in Sweden who had avoided flying or were trying to avoid flying because of the climate. So that is getting really close to a critical a positive social tipping point. And I think, the whole goal of this decade is to reach this positive social tipping point that will enable these transformative changes to a stable climate and a healthy, thriving society and living world, instead of the tipping points that we desperately want to and must avoid, which are these catastrophic climate and ecological tipping points that work against us and make the climate crisis worse and turn nature into, instead of absorbing our mess, into exacerbating it. And those are the tipping points we need to avoid.
Excellent comparison of the two tipping points. I have lots of more questions for you, and I could talk to you all evening about this book. But I thought I would open up the floor for some other questions from the audience. So I have some more questions that I will take if nobody else asks questions, but I thought I would read the ones that we do have so far for you. So here's a longer question from Max. Please bear with me. He says, I have a question for Kim, however, more of a general nature than connected to the book, which he hasn't read yet.
Sorry, I don't want to listen to you, Matt. No, I'm just kidding. That's fine. Non-book related questions are also allowed. Questions. Yes, but I bet the answer's on the book. I'll see if I can find the answer in the book to, prove my point of like, hey, just read the book. No, go
ahead. He writes, as Kim said, we have quite extensive understanding of what could be done to reduce our emissions contributions to climate change. For a while, knowledge was thought to be a game changer. Now that most other people are carrying a vast amount of information in their pockets in form of smartphones without changing their behaviors is questioned. What then will bring the change? What is needed for transformation to happen? Is this many individuals doing small things going to bring the change? Or what will make us or people act?
Great question. I am going to read from the book to answer that question, just to be a pain. But yeah, we know that the information deficit model of behavior change doesn't work. So it is not sufficient to simply inform people or provide evidence. That doesn't change hearts and minds. It is necessary to have the facts straight, but not sufficient. So policies and behaviors don't just, invent themselves out of facts. So page 149. Research shows that two things motivate people to take meaningful action. The first is internalizing knowledge of the seriousness of the climate crisis and accepting their share of personal responsibility. If it appears to be someone else's problem, people don't take action. Basically, people care about doing the right thing and feel better when they do. The second big kick in the pants is seeing others actually act. As humans, we follow and are inspired by others' behavior. Climate actions like avoiding flying or getting solar panels are socially contagious and help people feel empowered to make necessary changes. Behaviors also ripple outward to shape culture. So that's one piece of it, and I can leave it there.
Thank you. I'm so impressed that you had that on hand.
It was flagged. I've read that one before.
All right. Question number 2. Ian asks, hi, Kimberly. Do you have any comments, suggestions on the perfect being the enemy of the good? A possible example is existing nuclear energy.
Yes. That's a great question. I have to think about how to formulate an answer. Well, if the question is about nuclear energy, it's clear that maintaining well-run existing nuclear energy is helpful from a climate perspective because that is carbon-free energy. And if we close down those energy sources, we have to build more new carbon-free energy that much faster. But that said, it's also clear that nuclear energy is politically unpopular and more than that, very slow and expensive to build. And I think what the research is showing is that distributed and decentralized energy both is better at creating jobs, which is a good thing, and at scaling up and out faster. So basically, by making distributed things like solar panels and installing them, learning happens faster and can help speed up the necessary changes. So I guess, it's kind of a theory of change question in general. Should we hold out for the perfect solution or should we accept existing solutions? And I think smart people that I respect in general have different points of view on that. So my main thought on that is that people who fundamentally agree that we should leave fossil fuels in the ground and actually solve the climate crisis should not spend our time fighting with each other about our own preferred strategies to do that, but get on with the work that we're doing because we need all of it, actually.
Yep, that was recently. I saw an interview with a climate scientist saying, what change would you prefer, from individuals or from policy? And the scientist said, everything at once. It's just, yeah, that's where we are. All the changes that are positive immediately. Next question from Sarah. You mentioned that a good way to inspire the public is through other sources, such as art and literature, which I love. And you also mentioned that it is difficult to inspire politicians to act, as a lot of the solutions are not sexy. So how would you suggest we inspire politicians to act and implement the policies needed, even if they aren't necessarily sexy?
Great. You know what is sexy to politicians? Hearing from the people who keep them in office. So as citizens, we need to be much more active at basically making it impossible for our elected representatives to ignore us. And I think that's why groups like Climate Students Lund and Fridays for Future and other climate groups are so important, because they really push the needle politically. And that research shows that politicians in general are quite aware of the climate crisis and know that it's happening, know that it's bad, but almost never hear from their constituents that it's something we care about. So they're hearing much more often from lobbyists and corporate interests that are lobbying for the status quo, which is heading to climate disaster. So basically, even though it's not sexy, we know that voting is incredibly important, voting for politicians with good climate scores, for supporting organizations that do the work to figure out who those politicians are so we can support them. Here in Sweden, Naturskyddsföreningen does an evaluation of politicians based on their climate voting record that's really valuable. And organizing, being part of political campaigns and social movements and nonviolent demonstrations and writing, getting active in the media, those things are what change politicians. So I can just mention, I have a monthly newsletter called We Can Fix It. That's over on Substack. I can put the link in the chat, and everyone's welcome to sign up for that. It's free, and it's about an 8-minute read a month. And I just wrote a piece about how to get politicians to act, so I can put that there.
Excellent. I think a lot of people would appreciate that. So call your politicians and make sure to vote. Speaking of changing things, and especially as a chairperson of Climate Students Lund, we've been fighting a lot with Lund University how to make effective change. Do you have any recommendations? How do we effectively change Lund University to follow these guidelines that you put out, and to reduce flying, especially, I think is the main concern. Electricity, I suppose, as well, but the amount of flying is just incredulous still.
Well, I think first I can say we're lucky to be at the point that we are, because Sweden and Lund actually have solid policies and promises in place. Mm-hmm. They're not perfect, but Sweden has the climate law that says we will reduce emissions 85% by 2045. Lund University has actually signed on to this agreement that gets very little attention, and I never hear the leadership talking about it, and I never hear it mentioned. But actually, Lund University has committed to do our fair share for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees by 2030. So that implies really big and dramatic changes, which are laid out in, I'm sure you're familiar, this climate policy framework that all the universities in Sweden have signed off on quite clearly. So it's basically, I think, a matter of saying, hey, in the same way we can say, hey, world, remember those sustainable development goals you signed up for? You're actually not on track to meet them. And here's, the gap is widening. Here's what you have to do to close it. The same with Lund University, saying, hey, university, remember that you are a place whose mission is to understand, explain, and improve life. That is what Lund University is, and the human condition, right? That's our mission. And we're creating knowledge, we're teaching students, we're learning from students as well. It is essential that we live by those values. Plus, we've signed on to this framework agreement, which tells us which policies to put in place, and we're not doing it. So I think, pointing out that gap really loudly is really important, because leaders are responsible for keeping their promises, and if they don't, they lose their positions of leadership. So I think it's really important to have groups like Climate Students Lund that are pushing on the leadership and holding them accountable and making this visible, because a lot of people aren't paying as much attention, don't know about this. The other thing I'll say is creating a culture of change and kind of planting the seeds, as we were talking about earlier, around the university. So within different departments, within all the faculties. I mean, basically, it won't work to just have a top-down decision, and basically leaders are not bold enough, unfortunately, usually, to make really sweeping changes, but also to have legitimacy, those changes need to be anchored in demands and what the public that they represent wants. So in that case, we need to be demanding, as researchers, as staff, as students of the university, this is the kind of university we want to be a part of. These are the steps we want to take, and have people from throughout the university who can talk with their own communities and sort of build that movement. I think that is really important.
So to those of you who are at Lund University, feel free to join us. To those of you who are not in university or in another company, the same rules apply to you. Leadership answers to whoever's complaining, I suppose. And so get on to it. There's some more questions come in, and I thought I would ask them. One of them is from Anonymous, saying, what do you think is a sustainable way to invest your savings, since index funds and so-called sustainability funds aren't that sustainable?
Really important question. At the personal level, it's important to take our money out of big banks, because they are financing fossil expansion and construction and extraction and all the bad things that we should have stopped long ago. But there are reports saying how many billions and billions of dollars have been spent since the Paris Agreement was signed. So they've had their chance to change their ways, and they have not. So I've taken my money out of Nordea, which is Lund University's default bank, and one of the worst in climate scores, and taken it to Sparbanken Skåne. Mm-hmm. So the Sparbanken system is more like a credit union in the US, so it's more locally based, and they're not investing in fossil fuels, basically. So that's where my money is, and my investments, I've also for personal investments, I check them with Avanza has a tool in Sweden, and in the US, I have something called the Etho Climate Leadership Fund, which is, I won't go into details, but basically there are ways to do sustainable investment. Obviously, talk to an investment person if you are about to move millions of dollars. Don't just take it from me, but it's really encouraging that the data show that you can you can actually improve your money returns by investing sustainably and divesting from fossil fuels. And speaking of divesting, I think the social movement of divestment has been really important in these conversations, and basically taking away the social license of the fossil fuel companies to operate, which is how Bill McKibben describes divestment, is starting to have real impact. So I think supporting those campaigns through Fossil Free and other organizations, and continuing to push on Lund University to go further with that, that's really important.
Excellent answer. And it really, really becomes an individual thing as well, about what you want to invest in and what you think is valuable, if it's tech or something different. Another thing I might add to that is, if you're Swedish at least, the way the pension system works, also make sure you check out which companies are saving your pensions and where that money is going. Personally, I found SPP to be the most sustainable that you can check out.
Good to know.
Another question from Sebastian says, during political debates, you often hear the argument that countries leading the fight against climate change would do better in investing in reducing GHG emissions in the global south rather than in their own countries. What are your views on this?
I think it's total bullshit, because we are here in the global north, have caused most of the problem ourselves and still have the highest emissions. And what we know from science is that all emissions have to go to zero. So there's a lot of discussion right now about net zero, but the bottom line, according to Sweden's Climate Policy Council, who advises our government on meeting our own climate targets, is most industries, net zero actually means zero. And as far as the climate is concerned, the only thing the atmosphere cares about is as long as humans are still adding carbon to the atmosphere, it will keep warming. So that means that actually all emissions have to go to zero, even the ones that are more expensive here. So there's really no excuse to delay. Now, separate and in addition to that, it is really important for richer countries to support countries that have basically through climate finance. So basically making sure that, which we're not doing at the moment, meeting our obligations under the Green Finance Fund to support adaptation and clean energy development in countries that need it the most. So that doesn't get us out of our obligation to do that, but we don't have the luxury of choosing between them. We really have to do both.
Oh, excellent answer. From Francesca, she says, I think you've answered this a little already, but do you have any advice for having conversations about the climate on an individual basis, especially with people who might already feel that you're doing enough or don't really want to change?
Well, I think that's a really good group to have conversations with, because basically my theory of change is to be talking with and trying to engage with the group who already is concerned or alarmed about the climate crisis, which is the majority. So I often get the question, how do I deal with, my uncle who says it's not even warming? And I kind of say, just ignore him because facts won't change his mind, and we don't need him to, the 90% of us who actually already are on board of the fact that humans are warming the climate plus want to do something about it. Yeah, that's where I focus my time and energy. But to answer this question, I think asking a lot of questions is maybe a good way forward, and really listening to where people are coming from. I think, conversations that start off by saying, hey, I want you to cut your carbon footprint in half or do this, blah, if you're, meeting someone for a coffee, doesn't really sound like a lot of fun. So I guess trying to engage, I think of a conversation I had with Ludwig Bengtsson, who's one of your classmates, which was, he was asking about, what would you leave at this exhibition? Here's a backpack of the climate past. What would you leave behind in this backpack if we're going forward into a sustainable future? And I thought about this and I thought, well, I've cut my flying 90%. That's been the biggest change I've made to cut my carbon footprint. But, I haven't totally stopped flying, and I still have these flights back to North America to see my family, and I can't imagine giving those up. But I know that it's totally unsustainable to fly at all. So what can I do about that? And I started, in conversation with Ludwig over a while, where he also, to his credit, was like, ask questions and let me think about them for like an uncomfortably long period of time. I kind of came to okay, maybe I could sail across. And this was even before Greta. So it's like, oh, people can come up with their own solutions and think about, where is it that we can contribute and what kind of changes could we make? And then you can get into brainstorming and creativity and innovation and problem solving. And that part is really fun. But I think giving people the space to approach it in their own way and understand what they value most and what feels like it will be most meaningful for them, and focusing on that is a good way forward.
Excellent. We have at least one more question, and I have probably another 100, but we are at 6 o'clock, and I feel that you have lots of important research to get done. Do you have time for one more question?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, so this one is from Linnea. She says, my feeling is today that everyone knows about climate change, but do not understand how crucial it is. People in my climate action networks talk about the moment when you realize or you wake up. How can you give other people this wake up experience?
That's such a great question. Well, I think the answer that occurs to me is to talk about your own experience, because I think that is how we can be authentic and convincing and engaging by talking honestly about what we actually really care about. And so that's not a formula for what Linnea in particular can say, because only they know that for themselves. But, I think that's what I've tried to do in this book. And, not everyone basically, I feel like there's sometimes this what I think is a mistaken belief in the climate world that, oh, we just need to find, the perfect narrative or the perfect tweet or description or whatever. We all have to have this exact shared vision or message, and then everyone will get on board. And I just don't think that's how change happens. I mean, I think there will always be a diversity and pluralism of views and visions and values, and that is good, and that is how it needs to be and should be. But some basic commonalities of like leaving the fossil era behind, yes, the visions need to share that, but then there's so much room to be creative. So I guess my point there is that it's not that everyone has to have the exact same message, and actually the opposite of saying, what was the moment for you when you had that realization, and why did it hit you, and what were you doing and thinking and feeling, and what did it look like, and sort of painting that picture, talking about it or writing it or sharing it somehow, I think is how to bring it closer to home for people.
Thank you. The questions are just about done, and we are just over time. So thank you so much for this opportunity to get to discuss the book with you and your thoughts and hear what you think. Thank you to all the people who showed up and listened. Hope you've learned something and got some new food for thought. If you want the book, Under the Sky We Make, check out the link tree that I added to the chat, or the Facebook event that we put up. There's lots of links we can get it. You can also find it at the Lund the Lund Library, if I'm not mistaken, and you can borrow it if you don't want to buy it. Excellent read. Kim, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you for putting this together, and thank you all for joining and listening. I really appreciate it, and I would love to keep in touch. I put in the chat my newsletter, and welcome to join Team Climate in a monthly version if you prefer that to book, or in addition to the book. But yeah, let's continue these conversations, and thanks so much for all your work.